call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 130 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. In accordance with our routine motion, I'm informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. You have these cards on the table. Everyone who's here in person, please read the guidelines on those cards. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Pursuant to an order of reference of June 12, 2024, the committee will start its study of Bill C-277, an act to establish a national strategy on brain injuries. I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses. We have appearing as an individual Dr. Myriam Beauchamp, neuropsychologist and professor with the Department of Psychology, the University of Montreal. She's with us by video conference. Elizabeth Pilon, peer support worker with Concussion Cafe Yukon, also appearing by video conference. Concussion Legacy Foundation of Canada, Tim Fleiser, Executive Director, here with us in the room. And Constable Gerald Breeze, Center for Traumatic Life Losses, Janelle Breeze Biagioni, Clinical Counselor. Thank you all for taking the time to appear today. Colleagues, we're going to leave a few minutes at the end. We've got a couple of study budgets to adopt, but otherwise we will proceed in the normal fashion, beginning with opening statements and followed by rounds of questions. So we're going to start with Dr. Beauchamp. Bienvenue au comité. À vous la parole.
Welcome to our committee. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Myriam Beauchamp. I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist, full professor in the Department of Psychology at the Université de Montréal, and director of the Brain and Development Axis at the Saint-Justine Hospital Research Center in Montreal. I will be doing the majority of my presentation in French. I work with different groups who support this bill. I am honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today. I speak to you as a researcher supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation. I hold the Canada Research Chair in Pediatric Traumatic Brain Injury. Therefore, I would like to start by thanking Canadians for supporting my research. My statement has two objectives today. Firstly, to support Bill C-277 for the well-being of people living with a brain injury, and two, to demonstrate that the scientific ecosystem is key to achieving the objectives of the legislation, and thus to highlight the importance of increasing federal research funding. For the past 15 years, I have been dedicated to advancing our knowledge of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of brain injury in children from birth to age 18 years old. In Canada, we do excellent research and we are well recognized around the world, but our research is fragile. Conducting research is an iterative process that requires constant renewal of our projects and staying ahead of rapidly evolving technology. Undertaking high-quality research is therefore costly and depends entirely on financial support from our government. This funding is crucial in three regards. Firstly, to fund large-scale research projects that lead to concrete clinical action. For example, in my group, we follow over 1,000 babies and preschoolers to understand the impact of brain injuries on development. We have identified significant behavioral problems and are now testing family-based interventions to address them. Secondly, to have the best equipment and infrastructure and remain competitive with other countries, we require funding. For example, we use mobile neuroimaging technology that enables us to obtain brain images on the field when youth sustain a blow to the head. We have also developed a virtual reality treatment to improve the mental health and social life of teenagers after a brain injury. And finally, funding is crucial to support our teams made up entirely of motivated, dedicated, and passionate students and postdocs who devote up to 12 years of their lives to research without pay. For example, in 15 years, I have supervised 48 students who depend entirely on government grants to pay their tuition, rent, and groceries so that they can concentrate fully on improving the future of Canadians with pediatric brain injuries. Although progress has been made in recent years in the management of brain injuries, there is still much to learn about this complex, multifaceted condition. Maintaining and increasing federal funding for research is essential to the full implementation of Bill C-277 and to saving the lives of Canadians with brain injuries. Concrete recommendations include direct investment in research funding that specifically targets brain injuries across the lifespan from birth to aging, implementation of the recommendations of the Bouchard Report on the Federal Research Support System, and support pan-Canadian collaborative initiatives such as the Canadian Concussion Network and the Canadian Traumatic Brain Injury Research Consortium, which enable us to pool our expertise and develop a concerted strategy.
That the committee not overlook the importance of research in the proposed National Brain Injury Strategy, Bill 277, and ensure that federal funding is increased to guarantee the sustainability of all research groups that ensure the survival and well-being of Canadians with brain injury. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Bouchard.
From Concussion Cafe Yukon, Elizabeth Pilon. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
Thank you. Honorable members and guests, I am here today both as a person living with long-term impacts of brain injury, as well as an advocate for my community as a peer support worker for people living with brain injury. Thank you for having me as a part of this important conversation. When I sustained my injury by simply falling on the ice, I was 29 and working in a promising career. 8 years later, I am just 1 year into secure and meaningful work that sustains me financially for the first time since my injury. It has taken me this long to heal enough, learn how to manage my symptoms, tend to the intense struggles with mental health and nervous system dysregulation, and to find balance with my well-being and capacity. I have had a lot of help from different practitioners that I mostly sought out myself. I learned how to build the support team around me and become my own expert in a way. Out of necessity, which I have learned is a very common experience. To do so with compromised cognitive, emotional, and physical capacity is almost impossible to explain. At times, I was unable to walk more than a few steps without falling over, to make sense of how to cook myself a meal, or to string words together in a meaningful way. I didn't understand what was happening to me, and I needed supports that I didn't have. I tried to learn about what concussion was by trying to make sense of what I could find on the internet, which can be a really dangerous and unreliable source without proper guidance. It is also impossible to explain the loneliness and isolation that comes from this experience. Like I shared in my brief, if I did not have the financial, emotional, and practical support of my family and close friends, I would have very likely ended up homeless and or would have succumbed to my suicidal thoughts as a way of escaping the pain. Many, many do. All of this from an injury classified as a mild traumatic brain injury. As Dr. Charles Tater has said, there is nothing mild about it. 4 years after my head injury, I started Concussion Cafe Yukon, a peer support group in Whitehorse. People with injuries of all kinds attend, from stroke to electrical injury, concussion, and survivors of severe traumatic brain injury. 4 years later, I am being compensated to continue this work due to the high need. It is the only brain injury-specific community support in Yukon. The gaps in our brain injury support systems are so vast they are difficult to cover, but to name a few. Currently, there is no category of support for adults with acquired brain injury within disability services, whether you had support prior to becoming an adult or not. Many people are encouraged to drive themselves home from the hospital, if they can get there, with very little information on what to expect, how to take care of themselves, and often with inadequate follow-up. Many have to travel south for proper care and rehabilitation, like I did, which is stressful and challenging at the best of times, can provide added complexity and slow recovery. Most of us pay for our care out of pocket, which can be an intense burden. Women experiencing intimate partner violence can face further barriers to leaving dangerous situations and to recovery given the particular challenges of brain injury. Many members of our community struggle with daily tasks like food preparation, transportation, and executive functioning skills without access to support workers, which is both taxing on the survivor and their loved ones. The parents with brain injury in our community face immense pressures and challenges that impact the whole family system. Some members of our Concussion Cafe Yukon community are homeless, and Brain Injury Canada shares that at least 50% of people who are homeless have had a brain injury. Every member of our brain injury community face mental health challenges, as well as the caregivers who report feeling taxed, under-supported, and alone. We don't have any statistics on how many Yukoners are injured each year or who live with the long-term impacts of head injury. I do know that most people I speak to have a personal story to share. As shared in a paper by Lasry and colleagues in the National Library on Medicine, we know that the occurrence of brain injuries is higher and outcomes are worse in remote communities, as well as disproportionately higher in First Nations populations, meaning that remote Yukon communities are in significant need of supports and care. We also know that alcohol consumption through Government of Yukon statistics according to per capita sales is the highest in the country, and that substance use, struggles in mental health, isolation, and brain injury are all correlated. It is impossible to understand the need without necessary data or for frontline workers to provide brain injury-informed care at hospitals, in mental health settings, or in substance use spaces without more resources, education, and supports. Thanks to the dedication of family members, survivors, and brain injury professionals across the country, we now have a Charter of Rights for people with brain injury to reference. It is deeply impacting for me to have this on my wall for those I serve in community as a guide for a standard we are orienting towards, and to remind people that they matter despite what is being reflected back to them through our healthcare system. But identifying an ideal is not enough. We need to take collaborative action across the country in order to make change in how we respond to and provide care for brain injury in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pilon. And next, on behalf of Concussion Legacy Foundation of Canada, Tim Fleiser, Executive Director. Welcome to the committee, sir. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Fleiser. I'm a retired athlete, having played professional football in the Canadian Football League for 10 seasons, while also playing soccer, hockey, and rugby in my youth. My 3 young boys play soccer and hockey. Today, I'm here as the founder and executive director of Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada. Avec nos organisations sœurs aux États-Unis, au Royaume-Uni.
With our sister organizations in the US, the UK, and Australia, we are an organization that focuses on brain injuries with young people, military personnel, veterans, and athletes.
In the CFL, I witnessed many of my teammates suffer multiple brain injuries. Tragically, this has led to several of them struggling with severe mental health issues. Some have even taken their own lives. Far too many of these athletes have been diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, after they passed. CTE is the only neurodegenerative disease that is completely preventable, and our mission at the Concussion Legacy Foundation is to eliminate CTE by preventing repeated hits to the head, whether on the job, in combat, or playing the sports we love. Prevention and education are at the heart of what we do, and we are committed to raising awareness around this issue every single day. Je concentrerai le reste de mes remarques sur le...
I will focus the rest of my remarks on the subject at hand, Bill C-277.
CLFC supports Bill C-277 in its current form as a first step to significantly reducing the incidence of concussion and related brain injuries in Canada. This legislation has the potential to protect young athletes, promote safer sports environments, and contribute to the long-term health and well-being of future generations. Il s'agit notamment...
We want to focus on improving guidelines on returning to playing and raise awareness for trainers, educators, clinicians, and Canadians at large.
We believe in this initiative because we want to see our kids participate in sports without the risk of severe, life-altering brain injuries. We want to help our Canadian Armed Forces service women and men who put their lives on the line to protect ours, return home to their loved ones with the health and dignity they deserve. We want to ensure that those suffering effects from multiple head impacts have access to the best possible treatments. CLFC is proud to partner with research groups such as the Brain Health Imaging Center at CAMH. Dr. Neil Vazdev and his team are performing cutting-edge first-in-human trials to diagnose CTE in living patients. I was honored to be the very first scan for this groundbreaking study. Our partners at the Canadian Concussion Centre are performing autopsies to determine the prevalence of CTE in Canadians. This research contributes to our global brain bank alongside experts in Boston, Oxford, Auckland, Sao Paulo, and Sydney. CTE is preventable. With the right strategies in place, we can ensure that our children, our athletes, and our military personnel avoid the devastating consequences of repeated brain injuries. Mr. Chair, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank you and all the members of the House for their unanimous support of this critical bill. Like all of you, CLSC strongly supports Bill C-277, a pivotal piece of legislation that has the potential to enhance concussion safety through the implementation of a national strategy for brain injury prevention. Following the swift passage of this bill, CLFC offers the following recommendations to the Minister of Health for inclusion in a national strategy to support and improve brain injury awareness, prevention, and treatment. Number one, implement age-specific regulations to prevent brain injuries in youth sports. Number two, mandate brain injury education and awareness. Number three, establish an advisory panel on neurodegenerative brain injury treatment and prevention. Number four, monitor and evaluate policies using evidence-based methods. And number five, implement the recommendations from this committee's 2019 report, Tackling the Problem Head-On, Sports-Related Concussions in Canada. We can make this national strategy a reality and have Canada lead the world in preventing, studying, and treating brain injuries. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Fleiser. And finally, on behalf of the Constable Gerald Breeze Centre for Traumatic Life Losses, Janelle Breeze Biagioni, clinical counselor, welcome to the committee. Ms. Breeze Biagioni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Honourable members and guests, I am here today to speak not only as the CEO and founder of the Constable Gerald Breeze Centre for Traumatic Life Losses or as a clinical counsellor, but first and foremost as a family member who has personally lived with the devastating impact of brain injury. In 1990, my husband, Constable Gerald Breeze, sustained a severe traumatic brain injury in a police motorcycle accident while on duty with the RCMP. This left him with significant personality changes and an inability to manage his emotions. His battle, like so many others, was not just against the injury, but also against a healthcare system that was ill-prepared to support him or our young family. The hospital couldn't manage his care or his behavior, and after 3 weeks, with no rehab facility available, I took him home. I left my job, cared for our daughters, and became his primary caregiver. The overwhelming shift in roles and responsibilities took a severe toll on all of us, especially him, and 5 months later, he tragically died of a catastrophic heart attack brought on by the intense and relentless stress of his recovery. Sadly, our story is not unique. 34 years later, families across Canada continue to face the same struggles. Brain injury survivors, if they get to the hospital, are often discharged with little to no follow-up care, leaving families to navigate an overwhelming, fragmented system while facing mental health challenges and increased risks of addiction, homelessness, and criminality. Today, research shows that brain injuries affect more than just young men or athletes. Hundreds of thousands of women suffer brain injuries from intimate partner violence. Many Canadian veterans may be underdiagnosed, while Indigenous people experience a disproportionate impact from brain injury, often facing unique challenges in accessing care and support. Seniors and children are also affected as well. Brain injury does not discriminate. It impacts people of all ages, backgrounds, and communities. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. While our healthcare system has made progress in saving lives, we have not done enough to address the lifelong impact of brain injury or to ensure quality of life for survivors. They lose their sense of self, their connection to family and community, and their chance at a meaningful recovery. If we continue to fail them, we will continue to see rising rates of mental health crisis, substance abuse, homelessness, and criminal justice involvement. Brain injury not only lives in the forefront of these crises, but it also lingers in the aftermath. The cost of inaction far outweighs the investment in proper care. 2 years ago, I was widowed for the second time. During my second husband's 7-week battle with cancer, I saw firsthand what a well-structured, coordinated care model could look like. We didn't have to seek out help because every professional and resource was deployed to us through a cancer care model. This is the kind of model we need for brain injury survivors, but to achieve it, we need a framework. Our organization recently released the Canadian Charter of Rights for People with Brain Injury. It recognizes their right to appropriate, dignified care and assistance in navigating the healthcare system. But a charter alone is not enough. It must be supported by a national strategy. When we know the incidence and prevalence of brain injury in Canada surpasses the number of spinal cord injury, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, and breast cancer combined, it is perplexing that despite these crushing figures, brain injury remains the orphan of our healthcare system, left far behind while other conditions receive more attention and resources. This strategy is a North Star we have longed for. It will shine a light on what is working as much as it will shine a light on what is not working. It will provide the roadmap we need to coordinate care, train healthcare providers, and ensure that services are accessible in every jurisdiction. We can learn from one another, problem solve together, and ultimately improve the outcomes for individuals and strengthen the families and communities impacted in Canada. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Brain injury is not an individual crisis, it is a national one. And I personally want to thank my MP, Alistair McGregor, for standing shoulder to shoulder with me since 2018 to bring us forward to today. This is a historical moment for the brain injury community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Breeze-Biagioni. We're going to begin now with rounds of questions, starting with the Conservatives. Dr. Ellis for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I think, as Ms. Biagioni said, it's an historic moment, so hopefully we can make the best of it. Dr. Beauchamp, je voudrais commencer avec vous, s'il vous plaît.
Dr. Beauchamp, I would like to start with you. Can you explain to Canadians what the most common issues are for youth with a brain injury? I certainly can. We know that it depends on how old the person is. There are a lot of changes between birth and the age of 18 years old. And colleagues talked about adults and when you're aging, but there are issues, different issues. It can be cognitive issues, language issues, memory issues, or attention issues. They could be physical issues, problems with coordination, with motor skills, balance. It could be psychological issues. It could lead to mental health problems, anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. And it reduces the quality of life. We can't always foresee after an injury what will be impacted, and that's what makes these brain injuries so complex. And so we need a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge in order to support people with such injuries, because there can be different dysfunctions and it can have an impact on their daily lives.
Doctor, and maybe I'll turn to you now, Mr. Fleiser, and you obviously have experienced this firsthand as well as one of our other witnesses, Ms. Pilon. But maybe I think one of the things that I'm really struggling with to try to help Canadians is to say, you know, how do you help, especially kids who've had a brain injury, for parents to be better able to identify it? I mean, other than witnessing an injury itself, as we just heard, the symptoms are so complex that maybe it's difficult for parents to actually realize what's happening. So what advice would you give as someone who has suffered a brain injury to say, watch out for this? This is something that's common or serious or indicative of a brain injury. Feel free to expand on that if you would, sir.
So I think the best way to try and address that would be to actually try and prevent those injuries before they happen. We have a program very deliberately, provocatively titled Stop Hitting Kids in the Head. We know that children's brains are developing up until the age of 12, 13, 14, and having those children's heading soccer balls, getting tackled in football and rugby, and getting body checked in hockey is a terrible idea. That's the first thing we can do. The second thing is creating these awareness programs. We talked about mandatory education, and whether it's parents, whether it's teachers, and whether it's classmates themselves. I think of the story of Rowan Stringer, who suffered a bad concussion, didn't tell her parents, didn't tell her teachers, but had told her friends. And so asking somebody who's neurologically impaired to self-report is, again, a terrible strategy. And so we really have to teach this bystander model of teaching others of what to look at and what to recognize. And the first thing that should happen when somebody has a big fall, whether that be on the sports field, whether that be in the playground, whether that just be a garden variety accident, is thinking about the possibility of brain injury and looking for that behavior change.
Thanks very much for that. And just a follow-up question, if I might, through you, Chair, is to, I can remember being a physician on the sidelines of rugby games of my kids, and at one point there was a really interesting tool for your phone that was concussion guidelines that you kind of go through. Obviously there are multiple ways to help bystanders recognize concussion. Is there any apps or things that you're aware of or that you guys are working on that are going to help that recognition? Because, as you said, I mean, recognizing it, understanding it's part of the sport is the most important. So what advice do you have for folks at the sidelines?
So I think relying on people's judgment rather than relying on technology in terms of trying to best diagnose these injuries is the best way. I mean, one of the issues with technology is there is a barrier to people that either can't afford it or can't access it. From a technology standpoint, though, I do think that there is a role for that in terms of treatment, and so that is something that we have invested in.
Thanks very much for that. And Ms. Pilon, of course, you mentioned during your testimony that you yourself had a traumatic brain injury, and when we're looking at that. Specifically, what supports would you have recommended be available to help you in first your diagnosis and then your recovery?
Well, I mean, I imagine that moment at the hospital, and I imagine being told that, if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury, and that everyone can be different, and it's really just about bringing curiosity and awareness, and having maybe a pamphlet handed to me of what to expect of mental health or sleep disruption or changes that I could track, perhaps with a questionnaire, like the Rivermead post-concussion questionnaire, where I could track my symptoms that I only found several months later, or I guess it was 4 weeks later. And so I imagine something like that right at the initial moment. Encouraging me to call someone to support me would be a thing. I think about, sorry, I forget your name. Was it Tim with the Concussion Legacy Foundation? Is that right? Was talking about how.
Ms. Pilon, we're gonna let you off the hook there. We're past time.
Okay.
But we're gonna stay in the Yukon. And next up is Dr. Hanley for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. And don't worry, Ms. Pilon, I'll give you some more airtime. I just, first of all, want to thank all of the witnesses for your participation today, but also for your ongoing advocacy, and also salute Mr. McGregor for his perseverance in bringing this bill through. Ms. Pilon, Liz, greetings to a fellow Yukoner, and thanks to technology and House of Commons support, we're a few kilometers away from each other, but both can participate in this important meeting in Ottawa. And I want to thank you first for your courage to share your experience, and thank you for demonstrating such leadership on brain injuries, even as you progress on your own journey. I have many questions, but I want to start with Concussion Cafe. I have this image based on your written brief where you describe yourself at some moments lying down, eyes closed, leading the group. And that's an incredible image and also a testament to your own perseverance in this. So can you describe a little bit about the Concussion Cafe? Who comes to the Concussion Cafe? Obviously not individuals, but what have you witnessed in terms of the spectrum of people who show up and the spectrum really of what constitutes brain injury?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And P. Hanley, really good to be here with you. I'm just going to make a quick reference to my speech here because we have, I was noting that we have brain injuries from stroke, people recovering from and living with long-term impacts of stroke, electrical injury, concussion, and survivors of severe TBI from severe car accidents and things like that. So such a wide range of injuries, and it can look like, in the beginning we had caregivers and everybody attending, but then quickly realized that to have both parties attending at the same time was actually not in service of the best interests of everybody, and so realized that it would be best to separate the parties to have caregiver supports as well as people living with impacts themselves of brain injury firsthand. And I mean, it could be anything. I referenced this moment of lying on the floor because people had been sent my way to talk about their experiences with brain injury and ask me about mine. And we were just so in need of the connection that comes from and deeply impacted by these conversations with each other, where we would share stories and there's this understanding across the room without having to say almost anything, regardless of the type of brain injury, of this one string of universal experience that we can all understand without having to name it. And to have that space to be together is so powerful. So I realized that even if sometimes I was still not well enough to show up in the way I might want to, that to be there in any way, and also to promote showing up exactly how we are was a really important way to lead, and also just to, someone said, be the cleanest dirty shirt, right? So there I was, just trying to be the cleanest dirty shirt to hold that space.
I'm going to cut back in there because I only have a couple of minutes left, but maybe you can describe a little bit about how brain injuries may be more, you referred to this, but they may be more difficult to understand or to assess or to treat in the north and in more remote regions of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I was sent down south to the St. Mike's Hospital. My family came and got me, where they had assessments, where they had information to provide me, where they had a community of people, of specialists, of access to brain scans and things that we simply don't have here. So that was deeply impacting, as well as just the simple frontline education in the hospital, having, someone tell me to drive myself home or not telling me what I might be able to expect, like all those things can make the world of a difference.
Yeah, thanks. And I know that assessment and treatment for concussion, in particular brain injuries in general, is perhaps a little more nuanced and sophisticated than it used to be. I know Dr. Beauchamp referred to that progress, and I think when I would say that Dr. Pawlowski, Dr. Ellis, and I would remember the days when we just told people with concussions to go to bed, lie in a dark room, and until you're ready to go. So how would this bill help to get that consistent level of awareness and education to the front line in your in terms of managing concussion and brain injuries?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I mean, I don't fully know, but what I do know is that we need to know more. And so I hope that this bill would provide access to methods of data collection to understand more of where the gaps are, like Janelle said, what's working, what's not, and figure out how to pinpoint that. To provide more education across fields of mental health, substance use, medical, like frontline practitioners. Yeah, those are some things that come to mind.
Thank you, Dr. Hanley. There's 8 seconds left. There's certainly not enough to pose a question and get an answer. Monsieur Thériault, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for their interesting testimonies. I was rereading the bill, and it's quite shocking to see that this organ that puts us on the top of the chain is so easily impacted. And we're talking a lot about research, a lot more than other bills that I have studied. And without research, this bill, and even what we're talking about today, this subject used to be quite taboo. Talking about brain injuries in sports. And so my question is for Dr. Beauchamp. I was shocked. I don't want to make a play on words here, but I always thought that as a G7 country that Canada would be investing heavily in research to keep its brains in Canada. You talked about 48 students living off of bursaries and loans, and they had to continue their research through pure devotion. Can you tell us more about that, please? Thank you for the question. I think that before we talk about students specifically, people often forget that behind any treatment, there are years of investment in research. If there's medication that treats something, if there's applications, apps, all of these treatment tools had to be validated before being used with patients. And it's through research that we could validate these tools. Not long ago, we told people to stay in a dark room to recover, whereas research showed recently that people develop depression when they do that. They're isolated from their social lives, and it goes against their recovery, in fact. But it took years of research and investment to show and to prove that that was the case. So I wanted to start with that comment to remind everyone that clinical initiatives that we want to approve and that are approved by Health Canada come from research. Now, regarding students, if they don't have a bursary, they have to work because most of them aren't still living with their parents and they're studying full-time. And so if they don't have a bursary to support themselves, they need to work. And that takes time away from their research. And that causes delays in their certification and receiving diplomas. And so they depend on these bursaries, and often they aren't sufficient. They hardly meet the needs for the cost of living and tuition fees. Recently, these bursaries were increased, but we need to give them the proper conditions because they move research forward. We wouldn't have the discussions that we're having today if science had not advanced. And we talked about data earlier, and we need your work in order to have data. Do you believe that research on brain injuries is going well in Canada? Do you think that compared to other countries, you have sufficient investment from the government to allow you to be competitive with other countries and keep your researchers here? And you seem quite nice, you know. It's not enough. As I mentioned, research is costly and is increasingly costly because the technology that we want to use and high-end technology is costly. Neuroimagery, for example, and this was mentioned by Mr. Fleiser, doing imagery of the brain to see what's going on for one patient is expensive. Doing it on hundreds of people to have the data to show what's happening structurally in the brain, you can imagine that it's extremely expensive. It's about $500 or $600. And imagine, just in my lab, to have a proper study, we want to have 200 or 300 people. And the costs become exponential for such research. But we want that level of detail. And we work with other countries. Of course, it's necessary. But we also need to be competitive with research being done elsewhere so that in Canada we can be leaders, if I can call us that. We want to be at the head of research and treatment. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. And Dr. Beauchamp.
Please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's certainly a unique experience for me to be at a committee questioning witnesses on the bill that I introduced, and I do want to thank all of my colleagues for their unanimous support of this bill at its second reading. And I also want to thank each of the witnesses who are with us today for your opening statements. I think it's really important for us to hear the personal stories that are behind a lot of these things. And I really appreciate how you're helping guide this committee through its study of this legislation. Ms. Brice-Biagioni, I'll start with you, given that you are my constituent, and thank you for sharing how personal this issue is for you. And I do well remember back in 2018 when we had that meeting, and I believe you had just come from a conference called Heads Together, and one of the recommendations from that was the establishment of a national strategy on brain injuries, and that was the idea that led to us to where we are today. But what I wanted to ask you was that, you know, when you look at all of the ways that provinces and the federal government could tackle this issue, why for you is it important that we actually put in a legislative requirement for a national strategy? What struck you as that being an important item for the Parliament of Canada to be addressing?
Thank you, Alistair. Well, you know, as a clinical counselor, which I didn't start out to be, I was actually studying to be an accountant when my husband was injured, but going into clinical counseling and being able to work with families and survivors and seeing how they were struggling, and then looking at what was happening in communities where these, you know, mental health crises, homelessness, criminality was on the rise, and understanding how people were getting there, but there was nothing to address the challenges that they were facing to prevent them from going further or spiraling down. And it became quite a concern for me, and then to realize that from province to province and in the territories, there was not provincial representation, that the little organizations that were coming together were struggling for guidance and looking to the provinces, and then some of the provinces or in the territories, as you know, Liz has so eloquently said, those services and supports are not there. And I knew that our federal government was responsible for brain injury with our Indigenous communities and our veterans, and that's why I came to you and saying that this can be the North Star where all the provinces must come together and have the conversation, look at what's working and what's not working, share the information, but to be accountable to move forward with strategies that every jurisdiction can put into place to safeguard our Canadians from going further into these challenges and not having the life that they deserve.
I'm glad that you mentioned homelessness, mental health issues, and addiction, because Bill C-277 does reference those as a part of the national strategy. And I think it's important because what I want you to talk about is how do brain injuries interact with these really big societal problems? And how do you think the implementation of a national strategy in dealing with brain injuries, like, do you believe that's going to have a positive effect in dealing with the intersections with the criminal justice system, in the obvious mental health crises that so many of our small communities have, and of course, so many of our fellow citizens who are suffering through addictions and the opioids crisis that we have?
Well, what's really important to know is that the very first thing that will be taxed with brain injury for that individual and their family is their mental well-being. There is nobody I've ever worked with and gone through this experience, including myself, that didn't use the words anxiety and depression. And when you don't have those supports to help you understand what's happening, and you're left to navigate a very siloed system, which right now, and in British Columbia especially, we see that people can't access services outside of something. So if you have a brain injury, you are denied services with mental health or addiction. It's considered too complex, that they don't know how to handle it. But those intersections are real. And so when we don't address what a person is going through with their mental health and they turn to substance use to cope, or they're on prescription medications that can lead to those addictive cycles, it gets out of control. And we just leave them into this ocean of emotion without any safeguards, and then it leads to further complications. And certainly for families who are taxed to try and navigate the system and get supports where they're not even included, families aren't included, they're trying to, it's exhausting. And so often we do see that families fracture and these relationships end, and then the person ends up, often on the street. And so we've now clearly been able to see from the research that all of these intersections, the root cause often is brain injury, and that's why I say it lives in the forefront, but it also lives in the aftermath.
Thank you. Mr. Fleiser, I'd like to turn to you for my last minute here. Your organization does incredibly noble work, and there's so many organizations that are involved in this field, all with such noble goals. I'm wondering if you could give your opinion on how you think a national strategy is going to maybe build up a culture of collaboration amongst all of these great organizations that are doing this important work across Canada.
Well, that's one of the great lessons you learn from team sports is how to play with others, and that working with others, you're able to accomplish so much more than you can on your own. And I'm pleased to report it's already happening. We've tried from the beginning to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and there's absolutely a role for all the different organizations to play in a cohesive national strategy. We just need somebody to lead that strategy, and so thrilled that you have us here today to talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Fleiser. Next, Ms. Goodridge, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. As I was preparing for this meeting, I was reviewing the correspondence that has come in, and there's an exceptionally large amount of correspondence that has come in to each one of us members of Parliament from people right across the country who have written into the Health Committee to share their experience. And so I just want to acknowledge that I appreciate that, and that helped me as I was coming up with my deliberations over this, and that those things do get read by somebody, and you are heard. I'm going to start out by expressing my sincere condolences and thank you for taking your grief and turning it into something to keep your husband's legacy alive. I think that's a commendable space. And so my question comes to you of, what do you hope to see? Should this bill succeed in getting through the House? What do you hope to see as an outcome from this?
First and foremost, I would hope that this comes together to bring together the lived experience and the voices of survivors and family members to talk about what's needed, and collaboration, because there are things that are working in this country and there is a lot that's not working, but to be able to have that conversation, to share the education and information and develop some guidelines that we all can work from, some best practices, also to determine what future research is needed. We have a lot of great research that's been done. There's a lot more that still needs to be done. So the guidelines, education, prevention, and training of healthcare professionals. And when I say training, it's from the nurses, the doctors, to the frontline workers, to our police officers who are really becoming our social workers on the streets, to be able to respond in an efficient way and to know where to turn to and where to send that person to. So I'm hoping that that coordination can come through with all of us. And I just really believe in my heart that unless we have collaboration and conversation across the country, that won't be there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. To Tim, I really appreciated the opportunity we had to meet back, I believe, in June. And I learned something, what I thought was actually quite shocking, of how soccer was one of the things for youth that was actually far more risky than I had thought. And so I was just wondering, you have an opportunity here to speak to Canadians. Can you explain a little bit as to why and the work you guys are doing to keep kids safe?
If there's one single policy change we can make in sports in Canada to protect kids' brains, it's eliminating headers in soccer for kids certainly under the age of 12 and probably under the age of 14. It'd be even better. Just for context, there's 550,000 youth hockey players in Canada, 750,000 youth soccer players. So by participation, it's by far the largest sport. And the majority of these brain injuries in soccer happen, or the exposures happen in practice with an adult lobbing a ball at a child. And so entirely preventable. I actually don't really, as a former athlete, buy that kids need to learn to play the ball in the air that much that it should equate into the factor of an activity that we know gives them brain injury. And so when you think about CTE and you think about CTE risk, one thing that's important to understand, it's not the number of concussions that athletes have sustained, it's the number of total impacts that athletes get during the course of their career. So in the United States, they banned headers for soccer in 2016. They've recently done it in the United Kingdom. We're now behind. And one of the interesting things with this is, even if you're talking about athletic performance and talking about reaction time, some of the research that's been done just down the street at Western University has looked at those impacts and reaction time and found that for football players who see exposures in practice in a game during the course of a season, sometimes makes them 15 to 20% slower during the course of the year in terms of their reaction time. So even if you don't care about the health of these kids and you don't care about the ethics of exposing children to an activity that potentially gives them brain injury, just for pure athletic performance, we shouldn't be hitting kids in the head. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think I would assume everyone around this table agrees that we shouldn't be hitting kids in the head. And as a parent, I think that's something that's so important, and I want as many Canadians to know as possible, because that will guide best practices as we go forward. And I think my time is up.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Goodrich. Next, Dr. Pawlowski, please, for 5 minutes.
I've got 6 kids, 2 kids in minor hockey. Speaking about trying to prevent your kids getting hit in the head, that has to be a concern of all parents who have kids in minor hockey, especially when they're over 13, when you start allowing contact. You have kids in hockey too, Mr. Fleiser. Let me ask you, do you think the NHL is doing enough in order to prevent head injuries, prevent forms of behavior on the ice which lead to head injuries? And I assume you watch the playoffs. I think we all watch the playoffs, right? And kids emulate hockey, right? NHL hockey. We all emulate hockey, and I think, I don't know about the rest of you, but I grew up wanting to play in the NHL. I never wanted to become a member of Parliament. That's some kind of sick ambition for any Canadian, but to want to play in the NHL is the ambition of every Canadian kid, right? So we all watch, and all the kids watch hockey. They emulate what's in the NHL. And I'm a little concerned, I don't know about you, but I'm a little concerned with what's happening in the NHL. In the playoffs in particular, it seemed to me they weren't calling a lot of boarding, charging, roughing. They call high sticking, they call tripping, but there seemed to be a lot of people being hit 3 or 4 feet from the boards, going headfirst into the boards, no calls. Not only were there no calls, there was no commentary from the commentator saying that was a dangerous hit, which they usually do. So I wondered your opinion on that. Do you think the NHL is doing enough to discourage kinds of behavior which lead to head injury?
So I think the short answer is no. And I absolutely agree with you. I'm a season ticket holder for the Habs, and I go to the games with my kids, and they ask a lot of tough questions. And it's very, very difficult to watch two NHL hockey players fighting on TV, and then in the same breath turn around and telling my kids that they need to take care of their brains. It's a very, very awkward conversation. And what you'd love to see in sport, as really the leader and the pinnacle of the sport, is you'd love to see the league taking a tougher stance on brain injuries and looking at things like fighting.
I'll give you another example. So it was one of the Ottawa Senators players had an open net goal, went right up to the goal and shot it in. And then it was Morgan Riley from the Leafs went and cross-checked him in the head because he was hot dogging. And I guess Sheldon Keefe, the coach of the Leafs, kind of said, well, it was deserved. The guy was like hot dogging. And I heard nothing in response to that. I didn't hear the NHL criticize that. I didn't hear sports writers criticize that. Is that not the kind of thing we ought to be discouraging? Because I don't want my kid getting cross-checked in the head and figuring that's justified because the guy was hot dogging. Any comment on that one?
So again, children absolutely watch pro sports and absolutely take their direction from pro sports. And when you're talking about adults participating in a sport, and our organization in particular that has autopsied a number of former NHL players and found CT in the brains of players like Stan Mikita and Henri Richard, not just enforcers, but skill players. I think it is absolutely a hockey issue. Look, hockey is wonderful for all kinds of reasons, for personal development, which is why I have my children participating in it. But we absolutely have an awkward misalignment in terms of messaging between the National Hockey League and minor sports. And I'd love to see that corrected.
So how do you bring together your concern for head injuries and concussion and letting your kids play hockey?
Well, later this year, in now a month in Boston, we will have Marty Walsh, who's the head of the NHLPA, and he'll be making some interesting announcements about the NHLPA, and it's great to see the players starting to think and consider more, not just for their own health, but for the example of kids.
Do I have time?
Yep. Short question, short answer.
I noticed you mentioned your kids play hockey and soccer, not football. You played football. Why don't they play football?
So they play flag. And again, football, wonderful sport, wonderful personal development. I've had outstanding experience playing the sport. And I just want to be clear, our message is not that kids should not be participating in sports. Kids should be playing more sports. They should be more active. But kids don't need to be tackling each other at 6 years old. They can play flag until they're teenagers and their bodies are better able to handle it. Football's done a really, really good job of limiting contact in practice. You've seen that in the last two CBAs in both the NFL and the CFL. You've seen a new kickoff get introduced this year. Our data was that 30% of brain injuries were happening on kickoff, so it's great to see the NFL starting to address that. We've consulted with high schools and actually suggested the elimination of kickoffs in high school to try and help kids' brain health. So there is certainly ways that we can practice and play these games much safer than we have.
Thank you, Mr. Fleiser. Suite, M. Thériault pour 2 minutes et demie.
J'ai 2 minutes et demie?
Oui.
OK.
2.5 minutes, yes. Dr. Beauchamp, you talked about your research earlier, but can you tell us a bit more on what the goals are? You mentioned wanting to create immersive and technological tools. Can you tell us where you're at in your research? Of course. We always like talking about what we're working on. I would like to mention that we focus on very young children, babies, preschool children. We talked a lot about concussions caused by sports, but brain injuries can happen at any age, and it's the children from 0 to 5 years old that have the highest rates of brain injuries. So it's not teenagers, actually, or adults. It is, in fact, these very young children, and this is not something that is well known. And these are not brain injuries that happen because of sports. They are caused by falls. If they fall down the stairs, if they fall from a grocery cart, if they fall from their scooter. So we focus on this population that is often forgotten. So we don't understand exactly what the impacts are on these age groups. And so we're working on initiatives that can be compared with C277. Last week, we launched a website with educational tools so that everyone is aware of this issue. And there are tools to detect concussions so that people can observe risks and be more aware and be aware of treatments that, or rather information to help parents with treatment of these children who are very vulnerable. We are also working on digital health tools. We focus on school-age children and teenagers and virtual games. We know that we need to work with these children and offer tools that will be interesting to them. And so we're looking for different treatments for readaptation, and we're working with clinicians and focusing on recovery as a whole. That's all the time that you have, Mr. Thériault. Perhaps somebody can continue the question. I would just like to conclude by saying, do you believe that in the medical field, what you're doing is understood or known? If somebody wants to ask that question, that would be great. Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Gregor, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to actually turn this question to Elizabeth Pilon. Ms. Pilon, thank you so much for recounting your personal journey through this. When you look at C277, there are requirements as a part of this national strategy to promote information and knowledge sharing, specifically with respect to brain injury prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, along with rehabilitation recovery. There is reference to national guidelines, which include recommended standards of care that reflect the best practices that are out there. But there's also a requirement to develop and provide enhanced and integrated mental health resources for persons living with a brain injury. And all of these are legislative requirements of a national strategy that the federal Minister of Health has to develop with provincial and territorial counterparts. Now, you've told a very personal story about what it was like with the lack of resources that you had and the long journey you've had to go through. I'm just wondering, like, if this kind of a strategy with these kinds of requirements had been in place at the time you had needed it most, I mean, what kind of a difference would that have made for you personally? And you can, I guess you can speak about people who are just beginning their journey right now, what kind of a difference it would make for them as well.
Sure. Thank you, MP McGregor. I imagine, like I said, I imagine being informed at the moment of injury. And then I imagine I was referred to, at the time, there were a maximum of 8 physiotherapy sessions at the hospital. If you advocated to your family practitioner, because most family practitioners apparently didn't know about it at the time, and so I did that. But I imagine being at the hospital and having all of those, the doctors in emergency, my family practitioner being informed about what those potential collaborations could be, referrals to physio in an ongoing way, perhaps to a case manager and to a system navigator to help me figure out, what do I do? Do I quit my job? If I can't do it, my doctor's saying I should go back, like someone to talk to help me make sense of what decisions I should make, what the consequences of them may be, connection to mental health supports that maybe I don't have to pay out of pocket for. Really, it's kind of the sky is the limit for how we can collaborate amongst different practices, and especially if we do so nationally, so that there is this best practice standard of care that we can all aim towards.
Thank you, Ms. Pilon. Next, Mr. Dalton, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to the witnesses for their important testimony. It's appreciated. Mrs. Biagioni, I'm also a member of Parliament from British Columbia, and so thank you for the work that you do in the province. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective, because healthcare is a provincial umbrella. This obviously we're talking about a national framework, which is really important. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective as practicing doing the work in BC, how you're finding the trends with head trauma and brain injury, as far as supports, wait times, treatment. Are things improving? Are things getting worse? Are they kind of stagnate? Where are things at?
That's a really good question, and I would have to say what is challenging is the vast number of ways that brain injury is being discovered that it happens. For example, intimate partner violence, right? So Dr. Paul Van Donkler, his study shows that for every one NHL player that suffers a concussion in the game of hockey, 5,500 Canadian women suffer the same type of brain injury. Whether you're in BC or you're in Ontario, if you are one of those women and have never had medical support, never been to the hospital, never been asked about head trauma, you're not going to get those supports. And I think that's the challenging piece that we have right now, is that, yes, things are improving in some ways, that we have smaller associations coming together to provide those community services and supports that we know that work. They're not funded. They don't have core funding, or provincial associations don't have core funding. But it's trying to keep up with the discoveries that we have now, how brain injury is happening. And often I feel like we're running up and down the dam trying to put our finger in there to stop it from exploding. And I think that's our bigger challenge right now, is that we're becoming aware. We can't become unaware of how these brain injuries are occurring.
Yes, thank you very much. And I was a teacher for many years, then became elected as an MLA, and then went back teaching for a while. And there was more information, I would say, on brain injury, and certainly saw the impact, but it certainly impacts our young people and old people alike. On parle de la recherche et une question avec...
I have a question on research for Ms. Beauchamp. Are you seeing a lot of progress in your research? Is there a lot of progress on the world stage, a lot of advances in treatment? Yes. I've been working in research for 15 years. And when I was working on postdoc studies, recommendations were very different, and what we knew about brain injuries was very different. People think that research moves slowly and doesn't have an impact, and that's not true. In a few years, we can find efficient treatment and implement them quickly. Investing is worth it, and we need to have this research. The field of traumatic brain injury changes and has changed very quickly in the past few years. When we are able to prove that a certain treatment works, we can also see that the implementation, and we can show what works, what doesn't work, that's also considered research. Thank you very much. Throughout the country, I think we've got 30,000 or 20,000, 40,000 or 20,000 doctors, 40,000 nurses that come from other countries but cannot work here. And I have met some who are specialists. I am a Conservative member of Parliament, and we recommend what we call a blue seal, so something at the national level, so that people coming from other countries could be qualified, could receive qualification more quickly throughout the country. I think my time is up, but do you believe that this could help even in your field? That's all the time that you had, but if you could respond briefly, that would be great. Thank you. I would simply say that regardless of where we're from or what our background is or our training, standardizing knowledge will be beneficial for everyone.
Merci beaucoup. Next
Thank you.
is Sidhu online for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all the witnesses in this meeting, sharing your experience and knowledge on this important issue. My first question is to Ms. Pilon. Following on something Professor Bishop mentioned, what role do you see peer and community support programs playing in a national strategy on brain injuries? And what are the best ways to foster that peer support across Canada?
Great question. Well, I imagine, right now I'm reaching out to different peer support programs across the country and in Alaska to understand how they offer the services they offer so we can learn from each other and I can learn from them and continue to improve the services that I'm offering here in Yukon. So I imagine so first of all, peer support offers a way of understanding each other and a sense of belonging without having to do the labor of explaining, like I mentioned before. And also being able to share the resources and the learnings that we've all accessed in our own journey. And so when I imagine how that impacts us by giving us a sense of belonging and like psychoeducation about what's happening to us, different resources, it's very empowering. And so when I imagine different peer support networks across the country and I imagine us all collaborating, Peer Support Canada is a great model. They trained me in what I'm doing and are mentoring me in my peer support as well. And so I believe there is already a good infrastructure for peer support and for how we can continue to come together, provide feedback, provide experience, experiential data, and share our stories to inform all of the directions that things can possibly go.
Thank you. My next question is to Professor Beauchamp. Professor Beauchamp, what kind of training do frontline staff need to recognize the sign of brain injury among the most at-risk groups, if you can explain?
It's a great question because I think there are different levels of training that we can offer and we can standardize through this national strategy. Obviously, health professionals, physicians will have a more in-depth training in terms of diagnosis, but there are a lot of initiatives at the moment across Canada to offer, for example, through massive online courses, training to people who don't have medical expertise or health expertise. And these are things that we can come together, collaborate, and standardize for people. I'm thinking here, obviously, of in sports context, coaches, but also somebody mentioned teachers, after school care, educators, for example. I mentioned that I work closely, my work is focuses on young children. So daycare workers, day camp and summer camp workers, all of these people can be trained to at least recognize when a significant event has happened that could lead to head injury, but many people it doesn't even cross their mind. So we can offer a standardization of training for these people.
Thank you. And next question is to Ms. Bayagoni. I appreciate that you brought up the connection of the issue of intimate partner violence. The Public Health Agency of Canada and other federal health department have been working to provide funding to support women survivors of gender-based violence who are experiencing traumatic brain injuries. What do you think can be more we can done to expand those initiatives?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, again, training and education so that the person who's coming in contact with that individual would be able to ask some questions, but also people in the public to be able to understand that why this woman may be struggling with different challenges in her life, whether it's parenting, getting to work, keeping her appointments, and that public education and awareness can help lead to some pertinent questions that could help link her to services. I think another critical point, too, is to understand that a small study was done in Victoria with the Cridge Centre for the Family, that they looked at the abusers in the intimate partner violence, and what they discovered was that the number of abusers that had a brain injury were 100%. So I think, again, it's that prevention, education, and awareness, and then providing intervention, because we can prevent intimate partner violence by providing those interventions both for the women so that their life will be thriving, but also to the men and or women who are the abuser and have a brain injury, that we have to have that as one of the pillars.
Thank you. Mr. Flazer, you mentioned many sports changing their...
That's your time, Ms. Sidhu.
Okay, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Ellis, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was going to split my time with Ms. Goodridge. Just one quick question for you, Mr. Fleiser. I guess it's two parts. When you look at the research being done in Canada, how do we compare with the rest of the world? I know you talked about some partnerships. And secondly, I know Ms. Biagioni talked about the incredible prevalence of intimate partner violence and head injury, and certainly the prevalence is way more than those in professional sports. And is the research that is coming out, is it transferable knowledge to other forms of head injury? So how are we doing, and is there a transfer of knowledge? Thanks.
So I'm proud to say, as a Canadian, that some of our researchers are among the world leaders on this issue. I mentioned specifically the work that's being done at CAMH, looking at radio tracers and PET scans to be able to diagnose chronic traumatic encephalopathy in vivo, which is game-changing when thinking about people who are potentially affected by that disease. And so not just athletes, but also military personnel, survivors of accidents and violence. This is important research for all those different folks that are affected by brain injury. I know was able to go and tour Dr. Beauchamp's lab a couple of months ago, and some of the work that she's doing with the pediatric population, again, world leading in terms of how we think about that. The work at the Canadian Concussion Centre, which is part of our global brain bank, where they're doing autopsies and looking at CT, again, leading the world in this. That being said, I will advocate on behalf of our researchers. These are folks that are doing a lot with a little bit, especially within the context of our neighbors to the south, which we work very, very closely with our U.S. chapter, and obviously they're dealing with much more resources. But very proud to say that Canada is absolutely a huge contributor on a global level, and that this research is absolutely applicable not just to athletes, but to anybody who's exposed to brain injury and repeated head impacts.
Et alors, à Dr. Beauchamp,
Dr. Beauchamp, I'm a mother. I have 2 kids. One is 3, one is 1. You talked about the impact of brain injuries in children from 0 to 5. How can parents know when they need to see a medical professional? Because often parents don't know what happened. They just arrive and the child is already screaming. So what could they look for to bring a child to a hospital? Thank you for the question. I'm also a mother. I have 3 kids. It's a very important question because for these young children, treatment is very different. If we're talking about a 2-year-old, they wouldn't be able to verbalize what happened, what they're feeling. A 2-year-old can't say, "Mom, Mommy, Daddy, my head hurts, I feel confused." In our lab, we launched free tools that we developed specifically for that age group to give parents and educators the tools to recognize through observing the child's behavior what's happening. If their head hurts, well, they might be holding their heads or rubbing their foreheads, and that would show that their head hurts. We need to have different tools available to different age groups, and that highlights how complex the matter of concussions and brain injuries is. And we need different strategies, different tools for different age groups. And we need to validate them, develop them, and implement them.
A little bit on the record in English. Are there any resources out there right now for parents with young children to be able to recognize the signs and so that they know how to best respond to the potential brain injury?
I was mentioning that we just launched a website that is outward facing towards the community that has free resources on it, including a concussion detection tool that is not a diagnostic tool, but is a tool that educators, parents, and other significant adults in a young child's life can use to be able to recognize that there might be a worrisome hit to the head or the body that could lead to a concussion. But we need this is work that we've done in Quebec and that we're obviously wanting to disseminate widely, but obviously having collaborations and some strategy nationally helps us to bring those things together and to share them more efficiently.
Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Hanley, please, and I think he's splitting with Dr. Pawlowski. Dr. Hanley, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have 2 quick questions, and Mr. Chair, I lost my my stopwatch, so maybe remind me when I'm halfway through. Mr. Fleiser, I have a 16-year-old in grade 11 who, to my surprise, and I guess somewhat concern as a worried, both my worried parent half and also my emergency physician background, signed up for the high school football team, grade 11. So I'm thinking, of course, ACL, shoulder dislocation, and brain injury. But maybe you can just briefly reflect on what are the best practices, or are there best practices available for high school football and related sports like rugby?
Great question. And the way I'll answer that question is making sure that the coaching staff is paying attention to the total number of impacts that these young players are receiving during the course of the season. One of the things that we've been able to figure out in football was that 75 or 80% of the impacts that athletes were receiving were happening in practice. And so what we've counseled to football teams, and good to hear that your son has waited until he was a teenager and his brain and body was more developed to be able to better handle the contact. And so when it comes to the practicing of how they actually practice the games, coaches have gotten much, much better at coming up with drills where they're minimizing the total number of impacts that are happening. So rather than doing one-on-one blocking, it's using sleds or using bags to simulate those blocking and to work in technique and to really trying to limit the amount of live action that happens in practice. Now, you need to have some of it to prepare. You don't want to take a kid and put them into the game for the first time where they're seeing live action. So there does need to be some of that. And so coaches who ask and say, well, what is the right amount? And the answer to that question is to minimize it. Only use contact when you absolutely need it, and when you're truly needing to teach a technique, which is going to be directly applicable to the field. And if your coaches are doing that, you'll have reduced the head injury risk by 75 or 80%.
Thank you, Mr. Fleiser. Ms. Kayabaga, please, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to also echo same comments as my colleagues to thank our witnesses for being here today. Since I have only probably 1 minute left, my question, I guess, is to the number of people who have mentioned the socioeconomic impact that is connected to as well as the crisis, the opioid crisis that we're seeing, people who are living rough. Can you describe a little bit about how you're able to detect that most people who are on the street they have a brain injury, and what do you think with that information we as legislative bodies could do to improve the experience of people who are experiencing this crisis? Maybe I'll start with Mrs. Biagoni, and perhaps Pilon as well can also comment.
Certainly. Well, what we know is that over 50% of the people who are homeless have suffered a brain injury, and over 70% of that group became homeless after their first brain injury. So there's a significant cost to every municipality, province, and the country in general in trying to address the situation. And I honestly don't think people would get there if we were able to provide the peer support, the counseling, the day-to-day interventions when their injury happens, and that they wouldn't be spiraling down. So, as to what that's costing the country, you would know better than I. That's a really good question. I just know that inaction is far more expensive than taking action. And right now, so many things are very reactive opposed to being proactive. And if we could take some proactive measures, those numbers would come down.
Ms. Pilon?
Ms. Pilon.
What to add? I hear you asking about how we measure the amount of brain injury on the front lines of the people who are homeless and experiencing housing insecurity. And I think I don't really know. Brain Injury Canada released those statistics, but what I do know is
I'm sorry, Ms. Pilon. I think the question is more knowing that fact, right? Like now that we know that a lot, like I think Mrs. Biagoni has shared some numbers as well. What do you think is the missing gap in order for us to have better legislative policies and better actions to resolve the gap between knowing how many people are on the street with a brain injury and experiencing these crises, the social crises that you mentioned?
A brief answer, please, Ms. Pilon.
I would say a comprehensive first-line intake process across like the mental health field, where it meets the shelter system, where it meets the substance use, and those organizations all communicating.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Thériault pour 2 minutes et demie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're seeing that the cornerstone of this bill is research. And we want to promote research. I think that would have been at the top of the bill. We can talk about accessibility to treatment. We could have access to treatment, but if the treatment is obsolete or if it's not quite sufficient, well, that's not necessarily helpful. Dr. Beauchamp, earlier you talked about increasing funding, and you talked about direct funding for brain injuries. You talked about collaborative initiatives throughout Canada in order to implement strategies. But you also talked about recommendations from the Bouchard report. Can you tell us more about that? Certainly. I won't go into details because of the report, because it was already submitted to Parliament through other people, and I think it is available. But there are a lot of elements that are important in that report. Increasing bursaries for students was something that has been raised, but there are other elements that haven't been looked at. There needs to be significant federal support for research. I think that many have said this, not just me. we were saying a few minutes ago, we were talking about how people can be homeless and have brain injuries, and there are researchers who focus on this. And they know how to reach these people through protocols, and they know how to document this phenomenon. And so that's another example. This data comes from somewhere. The statistics that we have come from research. So we can't promote, or rather we need research to promote treatment, and we need to invest in research so that it is up to date, so that we could become leaders. Research is an iterative process, and it is constantly changing. We implement things, we test them, we see what works, and we change things as research evolves. And that's what's costly, but is very important. Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp.
Next round of questions for this panel will come from the bill's sponsor, Mr. McGregor, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe, Janelle, I'll come back to you for this final intervention. You know, in your opening statement, you made mention of the fact, like the incidence and prevalence of brain injury in Canada, and the fact that it, you know, far surpasses other well-known conditions like HIV, AIDS, multiple sclerosis, breast cancer. And despite those crushing figures, it seems to be left behind while those conditions seem to be receiving much more attention and resources. You also mentioned the costs, not only in lives, you know, the interaction with the criminal justice system, homelessness, the mental health issue, but those all have very serious economic costs to Canada as well. And I believe you summed it up by saying that the cost of inaction far outweighs the investment in proper care. So, in that context, you talked about, you know, your second husband and the care he received when he had cancer. Maybe you could take the final minute and a half to talk a little bit about what you would like to see with that proper investment, and maybe expand on the kind of care model you're looking for, but also how that is really an investment that is going to save our country a lot of money, but also a lot in human misery and lives that have been lost.
Well, I will say two things. First up is, one, I believe with all my heart that all of you are doing the best you could with what you knew. And our job, my job for these 34 years, is to bring that awareness so that people will do things differently. And I will tell you the second thing that's most important to remember is that hope begins with a heartbeat for every family member. I felt it. Hope until there is no hope. And so if we can have a proper framework like the cancer care model where people know that they're going to be cared for, that they have hope, that their loved one and their family will be able to go through the process and receive the services and supports they need, regardless of what that outcome is, because you may not know that, but you have that sense of care that you can then focus on your family and your loved one to get them through what they need to get through. And that's what I would pray that everybody would have, because when I received those calls, Mrs. Biagioni, we've read your husband's file, we know this, we know this, we know this, this is what I'm providing, and the next person that call you will be from this department, and this is what they provide. And that's what happened. And they all said to me, I have read your husband's file. That doesn't happen in brain injury, and families and the survivors are put into the place of having to prove over and over and over why they need the support. And I see that this is just being a prayer answer for everyone, that if that framework is there, they know what services and supports they need, they'll be guided to that, and they can focus on recovery and begin to thrive in life. So again, I applaud all of you. I know you've been doing the best you can with what you know, and my job is to bring you more information so you can now do different again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Breeze Biagioni, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I think that's a good note to end on. We very much appreciate you bringing your lived experience and your expertise, and admire you for your advocacy on this topic. As you can tell by the unanimous passage of the bill to bring it to committee. You have the attention of the Parliament of Canada, and as you can tell by the constructive dialogue that we've had, we all seem to be aligned in what we want. So this is a good day. This is a good session. Very much appreciated. So I'm going to indicate to our panelists online, you're welcome to stay, but you're free to go. We've got some housekeeping colleagues, so please don't run away. For Ms. Breeze-Biagioni and Mr. Fleiser, I would also encourage you not to go away, because I think we're going to get through this housekeeping fairly quickly, and I suspect there's some people around the table that want to shake your hand before you go. So thank you all. In terms of housekeeping, yesterday, colleagues, you would have received 2 study budgets, one for this study and the other for the examination of Private Members Bill C-368. Unless there's willingness to deal with these jointly, we'll deal with them separately. So with respect to C-277, is it the will of the committee to adopt the budget as presented, or is there any discussion? Sorry? No discussion. Do we have consensus to adopt the budget as presented for 277? That brings us to the budget for C-368. Any discussion? We have consensus to adopt the budget as presented. See consensus. The budgets are adopted. Thank you. 2 things. The analysts would like to be able to give you a work plan for the study of 368 and an updated work plan for opioids, but it's difficult for them to do that when we don't have sufficient witnesses to round out the panels. So this is a reminder. If you have submitted witnesses, please take another look at your list to see if there's more names you want to offer, and if you haven't, please get them in so that we can get the those work plans done. Ms. Goodrich.
Which parties are missing witnesses?
To Quinn.
For opioids and NDP for Bill C-368.
Is there any other business to come before the meeting? Dr. Ellis. Well, I think that's a great idea. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? We're adjourned. Thank you.
Water.